this lesson, we are going to look at biochemical families. Before we look at the biochemical families, there's just a little bit of general information about biochemistry that we need to just sum up here. First of all, biochemicals are macromolecules. So back when you looked at that hierarchy of organization that started with atoms and then small molecules, and then those small molecules got put together to make big molecules. That's what biochemicals or biomolecules are. In fact, the biomolecules can be referred to sometimes as polymers and monomers. A monomer would be like a small molecule. And then the polymer would be the macromolecule. Okay. So polymer is another word for macromolecule. Monomer is another word for a small molecule that makes up a macromolecule, just from that hierarchy. Sometimes monomers are referred to as building blocks or subunits of larger molecules. So here is an example of a monomer right here, right? We've got white, white, black. And notice we can link those together kind of in a chain-like structure. White, white, black, there's one monomer. White, white, black, another monomer, and so on. And when we put those little monomers together to make a macromolecule, that macromolecule is a chain of smaller molecules or a polymer. Biochemicals fit under the umbrella of organic chemistry, that term organic. And organic does not mean grocery store organic. It means that the molecules are based on a chain of carbon. So carbon is the backbone of all molecules in of all the organic molecules. Biochemicals are a subset of that, or of organic chemistry, that deals with just chemicals inside of living things, those organic chemicals inside of living things. Now, the beautiful part about biochemistry is there are really only 4 categories of biochemicals that you need to worry about. The first of these is the carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are also known as the sugars and starches. Okay, now, the monomers, or the subunits, units with an N, there we go. The subunits are the sugars, okay? And the starches are the polymers, okay? Or the big biomolecule. Okay, so what we do is we take little tiny sugar molecules and we link them together to make a large starch. And that's really what you're seeing here at the bottom. Glucose is a simple sugar. It happens to be a monosaccharide because it has a single ring of carbons. Disaccharides would be 2 rings of carbons linked together. Okay, and then if we link mono and disaccharides together, like you see in this starch molecule right here, then what we have is called a starch, and that's the polymer. Okay, so, and sometimes these carbohydrates can get quite complex. Notice, here's the main starch chain here, but then there's a branch off of the starch, and you can get that happening from time to time. You can get things stuck onto the starch branches. The more branching you get on a carbohydrate, the more complex the molecule becomes. Okay, so what are sugars? Sugars essentially, or starches, actually all the carbohydrates, are energy molecules. They're available for short-term use. Okay, so short-term use means you eat them, you use the energy right away. Okay, we are capable of storing small amounts of carbohydrates in our muscles in the form of glycogen, and glycogen is a starch that you need to know on the EOC. So we do put some starches in our muscles, and that makes sense if you think about it, right? Because our ancestors kind of came up in an area where, you could turn a corner, saber-tooth tiger, oh no, and we've got to be able to either fight or flight in that situation, right? Fight or flee to get away from that tiger. Either way, you need muscles that are powered with energy in order to deal with that situation. So that's why we store some carbohydrates in our muscles in the form of glycogen. Um, right now, what those starches do is kind of get you through the first part of a workout, for example, like the first 15 or 20 minutes a workout, you're really burning into those glycogen stores. As your muscles use that energy up, then they start to turn to other sources of energy in the body. Plants also have a starch. It's a structural starch known as cellulose. So some starches can actually be structural in nature. So cellulose is a structural starch. It's found in the cell wall of plants. Structural starches tend to be really tough, um, and they don't break down very well in our bodies. There are other starches found in plants too, but the ones that you need to know are the two that I've listed there. Now, carbohydrates are all made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, right? Three atoms, three different elements that are found in carbohydrates. Um, you're dealing with a carbohydrate because they have this very specific 1:2:1 ratio within them. Okay. You always have 2 times as much hydrogen as you have oxygen or carbon and oxygen. Okay. So carbohydrates are always like C6H12O6. That's glucose, right? C11H22O11. That's sucrose. Okay. So you get the idea there. Okay. So that's the carbohydrates. Right. The next group of molecules are the lipids. Okay, so this is another family of biochemicals. The lipids are the fats, oils, and waxes. Okay, so the only difference between fats and oils is whether they're solid at room temperature, right? And we'll get into that in an activity in class. But the structural monomer here is the fatty acid. So the fatty acid is the monomer we're looking at. The polymer, the typical polymer, is actually called a triglyceride. Now, there are other kinds of lipids out there that aren't put together this way, but for EOC purposes, this is what you need to know. So a triglyceride, as you can imagine, right? You've got 3 fatty acids that are linked together to make a triglyceride. It's a capital E-shaped molecule if you look at it. Here we go. Here's our capital E right there, right? So you have 3 fatty acids stuck onto a glycerol backbone. Now, if you look, and you can kind of see the picture that I have here, a fatty acid consists of carbon, 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 right? Hydrogen, 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 and so on, right? So these are hydrocarbon chains. You do have this little carbon double bonded to the oxygen, but notice that the double bond is outside of the main carbon chain, okay? Which means that that's a functional group that tells you that it's a fatty acid. That does not have anything to do with whether or not the molecule is saturated or unsaturated. Saturated fatty acids have all single bonds on the main carbon chain. So that one's saturated, this one is saturated. This one is unsaturated because it's got a double bond in the main carbon chain, okay? All right, so lipids are generally long-term energy storage molecules. So their purpose is to store energy for the long haul. They are particularly chemically stable molecules, which is why they are so hard to burn off. Once we build them, it's hard to get rid of fats, right? So these are chemically stable molecules that can store energy for a long, long time. You do make some other kinds of lipids like waxes, like earwax, right? Earwax has lots of different purposes. Waxes in organisms can be for waterproofing, which is another purpose of lipids. This is a secondary use or a little known use of lipids. So like plants would have waxes on the surface of their leaves to prevent water loss, right? Earwax for you kind of traps any gunk that could try to enter your body through the ear. It just kind of protects your ear a little bit. Lipids also provide insulation. Okay, so organisms like big blue whales and things like that dive to really deep, cold parts of the ocean have a lot of blubber, and that blubber insulates their body core to keep them from freezing to death. Okay, so their fats are also good insulators. Notice the fats are also made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Okay, so just like the carbohydrates, they're made of the same thing. But notice you don't have that 1:2:1 ratio that you saw with the carbohydrates. But what's important to understand is that these are the chemical cousins, both in function and structure, to the carbohydrates, right? They're made of the same atoms and they're both energy molecules. So it's really easy if you eat a bunch of carbohydrates for those carbohydrates to get converted to fats if they're not burned off. Um, which is why there are a lot of low carb diets out there, right? Because a lot of people were not eating fatty foods because, people thought fats were bad for you, so they stopped eating fatty foods. But then to make food taste good, you either have to put fat in it or you got to put sugar in it, right? And so a lot of foods that were fat free had a bunch of sugar in them, and people were still getting fat from eating them because they were eating all these carbohydrates in their diet, all these extra carbs, and those extra carbs were getting converted into fats, and that's why people were gaining weight. So it's very easy to convert a sugar into a fat, but not so easy to break a fat down once it's created. Okay, the next group is the group we're going to talk the least about right now. We have a whole unit dedicated to the nucleic acids later on. So I'm going to say very little about nucleic acids right here. Nucleic acids, the monomers here are called nucleotides, and the nucleotides actually have their own subunits as well, a phosphate, a sugar, and a base. Sometimes that sugar is referred to as a pentose because it's a 5-carbon sugar. Penta means 5. But essentially, these are not food molecules. These you get from your parents, not from your diet. Your DNA is your genetic code, although some organisms and even viruses might have RNA in them. Um, that base contains nitrogen, so nitrogen pops up for the first time here. You also have phosphorus present. So now we've got carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and hydrogen, and then phosphorus also, so an extra thing. So nitrogen and phosphorus pop up here for the first time. Nitrogen is in that base. So the genetic code is written in the order that we link these nitrogen bases, or the nucleotides that contain the nitrogen bases, together. So the two examples of this would be DNA and RNA. Okay. Then we get to the big one. This is the most versatile category of biochemicals that there is. This group, the proteins, does everything in the body. Just a whole bunch of things. They transmit information from cell to cell. Okay. They're responsible for nerve impulses. They are structural, like your skin, hair, and nail contains keratin, which is a protein. Um, they are useful for carrying oxygen around the blood. That's what hemoglobin is. They are useful for immunity. That's what antibodies are. They're made of proteins. Okay. And then later on, when we get to enzymes, we're going to talk about how they are useful as enzymes as well. Okay. So proteins, very, 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 very important group of biochemicals. Okay. They do most of the things. The subunit here is called an amino acid, and this is what an amino acid looks like. Notice with proteins, you have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen here. Occasionally in the side chain, which is this little R group here, and I'll talk about that in just a minute, you will get sulfur as well. So sulfur can be present in these molecules as well. The bond here that holds these together is called a peptide bond. And the reason why that's relevant is another name for protein is polypeptide. Okay, so polypeptide is another name for protein because it's a chain of amino acids held together by peptide bonds. Okay, and that's what this diagram up here is just showing you. The peptide bond is where you take the OH from here and the H from here. You pull them off so that you can link nitrogen to carbon, basically, here. Okay, so that's the peptide bond right here that we created by linking the carbon from one side of one amino acid to the nitrogen of another. All right. With proteins, all of a sudden, shape becomes an important factor in the way that the protein works. Okay. So proteins act certain ways because of shape. So for example, one type of protein that you have is a marker protein that kind of hangs out on the outside of your cells. And when the immune system comes by, the immune system cells kind of feel it and feel for the shape. And if the shape matches their search image, the cells leave that cell alone. In other words, your cells have these markers that say, hey, I'm a body cell. I belong here. Please, immune system, don't attack me, right? If a cell comes into your system that has different protein markers on its surface, then that's a cue for your immune system to attack and get rid of that cell, right? So they can act as markers, and that you can see right there where shape is important. Some proteins act as receptors. So they kind of hang out on the outside of cells, waiting for maybe a hormone to dock with the receptor, and the hormone fits the exact shape of the receptor that it's supposed to bind to, and that communicates information to the cell. So shape is a really important factor. And the way that proteins get their shape is by the order of the amino acids that you bind. Okay, so there are 20 different amino acids found in living things. And what determines the amino acid is this side chain or R group that you see here. What this is showing you is that all of the amino acids have this NCC backbone, right? With the nitrogen has two hydrogens on it, and then the middle carbon has the side chain attached to it, and then the final carbon has an oxygen and an OH bonded to it. Okay, so that's the same basic structure for all amino acids, but at that R position, you have different things attached for each amino acid. So the R tells you what kind of amino acid you're dealing with. And each of those R groups have different characteristics. Some of them are positively charged, some of them are negatively charged. And you might remember from your middle school science that opposites attract, right? Which means if you have a positive here and a negative here, the protein is going to fold over so that the positive and the negative can come into contact with one another. So proteins fold up into their specific shape based on the order of those amino acids. And that's going to determine how the protein functions. If the protein loses its shape, it can't function properly. Okay, so shape's really important here for proteins. So those are your biomolecules. That's just the general run through. You should be focusing on which ones you get from your diet, which ones you get from other places. And then if they come from your diet, identify some foods where you would find those biomolecules that you need to get in your diet.